This lecture is on the persecution of Christianity. And we'll start talking about someone who was originally named Saul, but would later change his name to Paul. We need to understand that, of course, as we mentioned earlier, Jesus was Jewish. And of course, the early disciples were also all Jewish. However, Jesus challenged certain aspects of traditional Jewish understandings of their faith. So what this means is that the early Christians, of course, like I said, were basically all Jewish. And so Christianity was kind of a heresy within Judaism rather than a fully blown separate religion. And if you're not familiar with what the word heresy means, it basically means you're a bad follower of the religion in a sense, right? So if one Jewish person calls another Jewish person a heretic, that would mean saying, well, you're not being a good Jew. You're believing things you shouldn't believe as a Jewish person. You're acting in ways you shouldn't act as a Jewish person. So basically, at first, Christianity just starts off as a Jewish movement. And, by Jews that embrace it, it seems great. By Jewish people who reject it, it seems really bad. It seems like a heresy. And one of the people who saw it as a heresy, as a bad form of Judaism, was a man named Saul. And he actually persecuted Christians. He took part in the killing of Christians. But later on, according to one of his own letters and the Acts of the Apostles, Saul would have a religious experience where he believed that he had a vision of the risen Christ, and after that would become a Christian and a missionary, and would go around trying to convert people to Christianity, founding churches, and coming into contact with other Christian churches as he traveled about. And one thing, we can't underestimate his importance in the development of Christianity. So in the New Testament, I believe there are 27 books in the New Testament. I think he wrote 13 of them. And those are generally letters to the various Christian communities that he had either founded or helped lead. So, he was a missionary, so he'd be in one community, and then he'd hear there was a problem in another community. Say he's in Corinth, and he gets a message from Philippi saying, oh, there's a problem here in Philippi. He would write the letter to the Philippians. So that's what he's doing. And one thing that Paul finds is a lot of Gentiles, that is non-Jews, were interested in monotheism. Right? One thing, if you've read the New Testament, there's a centurion who's a Roman soldier and who is a supporter of the local synagogue. So you had Gentiles that were interested in Judaism, that were interested in monotheism, non-Jews. And this creates a conflict within this early Christian movement. If a Jewish person wants to believe in Jesus, that's from the Christian perspective, from the Jewish Christian perspective, I should say, Christians who are also Jews, that's not a big deal. But what happens if a person who's not Jewish wants to become a Christian? Right? So let's say you're not Jewish and you run into Peter, a Jewish disciple of Jesus, and you say, hey, I want to become a Christian. I want to become a Christian. Well, Peter's not quite sure what to do with you because you're not Jewish. Do you need to observe the law? There were over 400 laws that Jewish people were expected to follow. Were you allowed to eat pork? Jewish people did not eat pork. Must you be circumcised if you're a man? And if you're not familiar with circumcision, that's the removal of the foreskin of the penis. That usually happens as a child. I believe Jewish people traditionally did that on the 7th day after birth. But if you're an adult male who wants to become a Christian, do you have to be circumcised? So there's this question, right? If you're not a Jew, if you're not a Jewish person, do you need to become Jewish in order to become Christian? And Paul is going to argue very forcibly, no. If you want to become a Christian, you don't have to become a Jewish person, right? You don't have to convert to Judaism to become a Christian. You can just become a Christian straight away. You just get baptized. You don't have to follow the law. You don't have to be circumcised. And this is very important because what happens then is that very quickly the number of non-Jewish Christians outnumbers the numbers of Jewish Christians. And as these new non-Jewish Christians stop carrying out Jewish ritual and legal behavior, and Christianity becomes a Gentile religion, you have a separation between the two. And Christianity becomes very much a clear-cut, separate religion from Judaism. So this decision, and I want to stress, Paul's the one who really was at the forefront of this, saying, no, you don't have to become Jewish to become Christian. Like I say, it leads to separation of Judaism and Christianity. It also leads to the growth of Christianity. Right? It also leads to the growth of Christianity. So this is very important, right? In a sense, what happens is the cost of becoming a Christian, or I'm sorry, the cost of believing in one God has gone down, right? Initially, if you were a Gentile, non-Jewish person, and you came to believe that there was only one God, and this was quite common, these people were called God-fearers. There was quite a large number of them. They were interested in believing in just one God, but it was difficult to become Jewish because of all the laws and the issue of circumcision. And then here comes Christianity saying, well, you can believe in one God and you don't have to do all this. So a lot of those people then will become Christians. Now, I do want to know, if you're familiar with the letter to the Ephesians, that's written to the Christian community in Ephesus. I was very fortunate when I went on this trip with my dad. I got to go to Ephesus, and I wanted to show you a picture that I think is interesting and gives you a sense of the kind of cultural context Paul was working in. This is a library, and over here was a brothel. If you're not familiar with what a brothel is, that's where prostitutes work. And apparently there was a tunnel between them. So people could say that they were going to the library, like to study, and then take the tunnel and go visit the brothel. And this is where Paul was trying to preach Christianity. So it's kind of interesting, I think. But just to give you a sense also, this is the kind of place when the New Testament talks about Paul preaching, this is the kind of place he would do it in. This is an amphitheater. As you can see, it looks like you could seat several thousand people here, but the acoustics were such he could stand down here and people could hear him. So when he would be out preaching, that's the kind of place he'd be preaching in. So it looks like things are going pretty well for Christianity, right? They're dealing with this issue of what you have to do to become a Christian. They're going to make a decision that will allow Christianity to grow, but they're going to run into trouble, right? After all, this lecture is called The Persecution of Christianity. And in the previous lecture, I talked about the glory and the infamy of the Roman Empire. And one issue I didn't touch, but I'm going to talk about now, is a problem when you have a bad emperor. When you have a good emperor like Augustus, things go pretty well, or at least had the potential to go pretty well. But a lot of the Roman emperors were not very good. And an example of one would be Nero, who reigned from 54 to 68 AD. So, first of all, one thing I should point out is how Nero became emperor. Nero, this is Nero, and this is Nero with his mother, Agrippina, right? Agrippina, there's her name. Nero became emperor because Agrippina, she had been married previously, had Nero. She convinced the Roman emperor Claudius to marry her, and then had Claudius poisoned. And then Claudius had a son, I believe his name was Britannicus, who was supposed to become emperor, and she had him poisoned. Right? So Agrippina, Nero's mom, basically killed at least 2 people in order to get her son Nero to become emperor. Now here's the thing. The relationship between these two was not particularly good. Eventually, Agrippina was always trying to tell Nero what to do. Right? Nero's mother was always trying to tell him what to do. And you may recall Qin Shi Huang's mom tried to kill him. Nero is worse by at least one step. Nero decides that he's tired of his mom telling him what to do, so he's going to have her killed. And it's this really bizarre circumstance because he wants it to look like an accident. So he arranges for her boat. She's on a boat, and he basically arranges for it to sink, but she survives that. And then he arranges for the ceiling of her house to collapse on her while she's asleep, but she survives that. So finally he just has her stabbed to death. So Nero was a pretty nasty guy. Just to tell you one other story, just to make it clear, you could just say, well, his mom had already killed several people. Maybe he thought she was going to kill him too, and so he was in self-defense. Okay, maybe that's possible. Nero's wife, though, is a different story. Nero was married to a woman named Claudia Octavia, and he got tired of her after a few years of marriage and wanted to marry another woman. So he divorced her and was getting set to marry the other woman. And the people of Rome were very upset about this because Claudia Octavia was a model of virtue. People had a lot of respect for her. I think women were upset because, this woman was clearly just being thrown away because her husband didn't, wanted another woman and, didn't much like that. So Nero decided that the best way to deal with this problem, and these people were demanding that Nero take back Claudia Octavia, so there's all this pressure on him to take his wife back, so he just dealt with the problem by having her murdered. So Nero's a nasty guy, and he comes from a very bloodthirsty family, so he's not all that popular. So in the year 64 AD, there's a big fire in Rome. Right, there's a huge fire. And remember, this is a time when they don't have like modern firefighting equipment or anything like that. So there's a huge fire, and he's blamed for it. People say that he must have started it because he's this cruel man. And he wanted to deflect the blame onto someone else. And, if you want to blame someone else, find someone that is like part of a unpopular group that's small and can't do anything against you. That's the perfect group of people to blame. And the Christians fit that bill pretty well. Right? Christians were a useful scapegoat. You can just blame them. They're this small religious group. They're tiny at this time period. Just blame them. And so what Nero did then was he blamed them and then started killing them in really terrible ways. So, for example, one thing he liked to do was have Christians, like live Christians, he would have animal skins put on them and then, covered in meat and stuff like that. And then he would sick other animals, wild animals like lions and stuff on them to kill them. And he would also dip them in pitch, tar, while they were still alive, and then set them on fire to light his garden parties. So not a nice guy. But there's something else here, and this is important for understanding why Christians were kind of unpopular and could be blamed. They seemed a lot like rebels, right? For two reasons, chiefly, I think. One is that they worshiped Jesus, who was executed as a rebel. So you can kind of see why the Roman government wouldn't necessarily like Christians all that much, because they worship a guy who they executed as a criminal, which is kind of like saying that the Roman government is bad. And also the Christians were monotheists. They would refuse to offer sacrifice to the gods or to the emperor. So remember, we talked about how Augustus, people would offer sacrifice to him and were happy to do so. And that religious ritual was something that bound together the empire. And the Christians are saying, we're not going to do that. Well, that seems like rebel talk, because you're denying the one thing that unifies this multi-ethnic, multilingual empire. So that's very important. Now you may say, wait a second, Dr. Roush, what about Jewish people? They're monotheists and they're not being persecuted. And you're right. But what happened with Jewish people was the Romans said, there's a lot of them. They're all in Judea. They may rebel if we push them too much. And of course they do rebel in 66. And at least they're following the traditions of their fathers. So in a sense, the Romans said, we can kind of tolerate Jewish people not sacrificing the emperor because they're following this ancient religion that was taught to them by their ancestors. We're fine with that. But Christianity, that's new. The Christians themselves say that Jesus lived just like 30 years ago. This is a new religion. It's a superstition. So no exemption for them. Now, these persecutions would not just go on under Nero. They would continue on sporadically throughout the empire. And it's about this time that two very important Christian leaders are killed. On the left, you can see Paul getting ready to be decapitated. His head will be cut off. Fun fact, if that's the appropriate term, Paul was a Roman citizen. And remember how I said that the Romans would extend citizenship to bind their empire together? Well, Paul was Jewish. He was a Hebrew, but he was still a citizen. And as a citizen, he could not be crucified. You don't usually crucify citizens, so he was executed by having his head cut off, which is much better than being crucified. On the right, though, Peter was not a citizen, and so Peter was crucified, and the legend goes that Peter asked to be crucified upside down because he didn't feel worthy to die like Christ died, right? He didn't feel worthy to have that exact same manner of death. So I want to stress, things don't look good for Christianity. They're a small, unpopular religious organization. The government does not like them and is killing them, and some of their very most important leaders have been killed. So things are not good, off to a good start for Christians and Christianity.